everyone, in this video lecture we are covering the topic of classification today. So here I have a picture of lots of different living organisms. So I want you to think, if you were to just be observing these organisms out in nature, how would you come up with names for them? How would you decide to group these different organisms? The most logical answer, just based on looking at them, is to say, what traits do they have? And, ones that have similar traits, let's group them together. Ones that maybe aren't as similar, we're going to keep them in separate groups, right? And this is how we began classifying organisms way back before DNA technology. We would just look at the physical traits and say, the more similar they are in terms of what we see, the more likely they should be grouped together. So things that, could fly would be in a group. Things that had 4 legs would be in a group. Plants versus animals would be in their own groups. And then from there, you could keep looking at these shared traits and get smaller and smaller and smaller groups. Then we could use these traits to help develop names. And so this is what was done hundreds of years ago, again, way before DNA technology existed, to come up with groupings of species based on how similar or different they were. And so when we talk about classification, it's really this process of naming and sorting organisms based on those shared traits. And so an example of this would be the trait of warm versus cold-blooded. So we could have a group of organisms that are warm-blooded and a group of organisms that are cold-blooded. And this process of grouping organisms based on these kind of either-or traits was developed by Carolus, I'm thinking is how you say that name, Linnaeus. And he came up with this system that we still use today. In the process, or the branch of science that we use to group organisms, we call that taxonomy. Okay, so a lot of the taxonomy, the information we have today based on how organisms are grouped, really began with Linnaeus. A lot of modifications have been done in groupings and naming of organisms since, but the basis of the structure of how organisms are grouped and named really started with him. And so when we talk about these classifications or groupings of organisms, there are these major levels that we use to separate out organisms based on some specific trait. So here we have kind of an acronym. There's lots of different mnemonic devices out there to remember the order. But if we start with the D in this little pyramid here, or inverted pyramid, that part of this diagram is the largest chunk of the pyramid here. And D stands for domain. This is the largest classification group that an organism is going to belong to. It's the most broad, most general. So in this example here, I have the domain Eukarya. And the shared trait that any organism that belongs in this group would have is that it has cells with a nucleus. Then the next taxonomic level down is going to get a little bit more specific. And so that would represent the kingdom level. And so an example of a kingdom is the animal kingdom. So in order to belong to this kingdom, you must be an organism that takes in their own food. That's what makes you an animal. So the kingdom level is below domain. So that means if you're in the animal kingdom, you also belong to domain Eukarya. But then we can keep going further and further down this pyramid here and get more and more and more specific. The very bottom taxonomic level is at the species level. So in this case, a specific species is Homo sapiens, or humans. And what makes Homo sapiens unique compared to any other species out there is they have a high forehead and thin skulled bones. Whereas if you just look at the genus level, in order to belong to that genus, you need to have upright posture and a large brain. So what makes Homo sapiens unique is the shape of their forehead and the thickness of the skull bones. Okay, so if I look at this species and look at all the taxonomic levels above it, Homo sapiens would have all of these traits. They have flat faces and 3D vision, collarbones and grasping fingers. They're mammals, so they have fur or hair. Obviously, humans have hair. With milk glands, we have a backbone. We take in our own food, and our cells have a nucleus. Okay, so the bottom levels are most specific, and they have all the traits above. Top is least specific, very broad. It doesn't have any of the traits below it. To look at those top 2 levels in more detail, so there are 3 domains. There's the bacteria, archaea, and eukarya domains. And then there are the I have 6 kingdoms here. It varies depending on where you look. So we have the kingdom of bacteria. So again, falls in the domain. And these are just really simple unicellular organisms. Archaea is very similar to bacteria. However, these are organisms that tend to live in really extreme environments, like really, really hot, or in, sulfur springs, things like that, where it's really extreme and most life wouldn't be able to exist. The domain of eukarya is broken up into 4 different kingdoms. There's the protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. It's just the Latin way of saying it, so like plant and animal kingdoms. So protists are unicellular organisms, but they're a little bit more complex than bacteria or archaea, so they get grouped out, and they're in eukarya, which means their cells must have a nucleus, which is what we see here in this diagram. Fungi, they could be unicellular or multicellular organisms, and what's unique is that they have the ability to absorb their food. Plants, what makes them unique? They tend to be multicellular organisms that make their own food. There are cases of plants that are unicellular. And then animalia, we are definitely more complex organisms, and we must be able to take in and eat our own food. That's the main characteristic that distinguishes animalia from the rest of the other kingdoms. So when it comes to naming organisms, every organism is going to have a Latin scientific name. And scientific names are 2 parts, kind of like a first and a last name, and it's based on those taxonomic levels. So the first name is going to be the taxonomic level of the genus, and its last name is going to be the taxonomic level of species. So every scientific name will have a genus and species to it. And some formatting for you, the first name, the genus, is always capitalized. The last name is always lowercase. And in terms of how you write it, if you're typing it, the Latin name or scientific name should always be in italics. So an example here, this is a sea lettuce, a common seaweed found in New England. So we might just see it on the beach and call it sea lettuce. That's its common name. But if we were to give it its scientific name, its genus and species, it belongs to the genus Ulva, and it's the species Lactuca. So its full scientific name is Ulva lactuca. And so that lowest taxonomic level of species is really important, because when we talk about biodiversity, we want to have lots of different species. Well, we need to think about what makes a species a unique species. And so there are different definitions of what a species is. We know it's that lowest taxonomic level. But in this case, we're going to think of a species as it's a group of organisms that have the ability to reproduce with one another, and the offspring that they produce are fertile, meaning that the offspring could then go on and reproduce itself. So an example here is you have a horse and you have a donkey. So just based on the names alone, we would think, oh, they probably do not belong to the same species, but if we look at just their traits and what they look like, they kind of look similar, so maybe they are the same species. So we can have a horse and donkey mate. They can produce an offspring, which is a hybrid of the horse and donkey, which we call a mule. However, mules are sterile. They do not have the ability to produce their own offspring. They can't produce a mule. So because of that, mules are not considered a horse. They're not considered a donkey. They're just a hybrid of the 2 species. And horses and donkeys, we know, cannot belong to the same species because their offspring are not fertile. So horses are one species, donkeys are another. They are not the same species because when they reproduce, their offspring is not fertile. And with DNA technology, figuring out what is a species and what is not the same species has become a lot easier. So we do have the ability to use DNA and genetic technologies to figure out exactly if two organisms belong to the same species or not. But before DNA, this is how individuals would figure that out, is have two organisms reproduce and determine if they make fertile offspring or not.